All right. We are 2 seconds into live, and I always kind of wait to give people a chance to join, but I I thank you for being up early with me, because I know it is early on your side of the world, and I appreciate you being here. And we're gonna absolutely, you got your coffee to keep you going. And we are so, I mean, we even are off to a better start this time because I think around this time last time we already had seen the glitches and knew things weren't working. So
Yes.
we are in a sweet spot right now. So before I kick us off and introduce you or have you introduce yourself, I'm going to give it a few more minutes and see if we have some folks to join. And if not, we will kick it off and get started talking ourselves because I know they
Okay.
will be joining.
Every time I see your videos and or live streams, like I'm just so enamored by everything in your background and your jewelry, and it's very lovely to look at all of it.
Thank you so much. This is dirty. Jewel came in from out of the sun, but I thank you. My
I
background.
feel
So
like
my
you're
back.
showing off now.
I, I didn't intend to, so let me stop. But my background was purposely designed for working from home and having a decent background screen. So
Yeah.
that was intentional. But yeah, today is out in the yard. So
Oh my
we're
gosh, what? I need to take lessons for look that good when I'm doing yard work.
I did wash my face and put on lipstick for YouTube, but this is my hat and everything. My t-shirt was out in the yard.
You look so good.
Good. Oh, thank you. All right. Good morning. We've got somebody joining, so at least I know we are actually live and out there. So we aren't. I'm not going to hold it up anymore. And just give. I know folks will join. So I want to kick us off, and I am going to do the intro, and then I am going to have you introduce yourself. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching this a little bit. Uh-oh. Somebody is saying no sound. That is not good. Uh-oh. Okay, let's see. Here we go. Hang on. Thank you. Do you have sound now? Good morning. Do we have some sound now? Do we have any sound? Oh, let's see. It's always something for me. Oh, you can
You
hear
just
now. Okay, excellent.
Oh,
Thank you,
okay,
thank
good.
you, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate that. All right, so we got over that hurdle. Okay, so let's do the intros. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. They can hear, so I just might be okay today. So, good morning. Let me get to the right screen. Come on, Jewel, you just practiced this. All right, there we go. Hello, good morning, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Jewel Pearson. This is Miss Bohemian Soul TV, and this is Creating Home, a Tiny House series. And the segment that we are about to kick off is the Conversations on Intimate Spaces series. And every Sunday, I offer live content. I alternate between these conversations with guests, and I host the What's Your Question? Or frequently asked questions, where I answer those questions that everybody's always asking me. So I am hosting on Sundays. This is the place to come get all of those questions answered so that I am not in the inbox answering those questions. We're trying to do all of it live so everybody can get those questions out there and go from there. So to introduce myself, I like to say that I built a kind of fancy tiny house in 2015. And since that time, I have shared my journey to hopefully inspire others who are interested in the movement. I offer coaching, consultations, and workshops to help others in their journey, and I serve up a lot of representation in the movement along the way. It is my intent to build literal and figurative community that is inclusive and accessible, And if you find this information helpful, I always say, please like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, and then also turn on the notification so that you'll know when content is available. So that is the long intro. Thank you so much for for working with me through the intro. We're going to get into the conversation. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Good morning, Dr. Anson. Thank you so much for joining me. And so I have to say thank you twice because we had to redo this one because we got started and realized, I guess maybe a month or more ago that we had some technical difficulties. So I thank you for coming back to join us this morning. So before we go any further, please introduce yourself to everyone here.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Dr. April Anson. I am currently an assistant professor at San Diego State University in the Department of Classics and Humanities. And I'm a longtime tiny houser. I built my house in 2012, really with very little information going in, and have since learned a lot, and lived primarily on Kalapuya territory, the homelands of the Kalapuya people in what's currently called Eugene, Oregon. But I live right now in Kumeyaay territory in what is often known as San Diego, California. And I'm just really honored to be here and so excited to be in conversation with you, Jewel. It's a long time coming.
It is a long time coming, and we've been in conversation for quite some time. So when I talk about this series, I always say that I believe our homes tell a story about us, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And then for tiny house people, I really feel like it is mostly intentional. The intent behind building, the design, the journey, all of that, I really feel like speaks more to us as individual, and that's the decisions that went into building and all of that kind of stuff. I feel like it is all part of who we are in the journey, and that's the kind of stuff that I like to talk about in these conversations. So kind of some background before, so we've got a few pictures to share of your build, and then we'll get into the story because you're no longer in the house and you've sold it. So we're going to talk about all of that, and then the work that you've done in the movement throughout the years and how we've kind of connected, all those things. So I want to talk about all of that. So, but give us the background of how you even got to building a tiny house. Like like me knowing the story, it was more of, oh, let's do that kind of deal.
Yeah, I mean, which is a kind of classic personality trait of mine, which is
Okay.
I look at something and I think that seems easy. And then, it often is not. And I was at a conference for an academic conference. I do environmental humanities. And I was at an academic conference, had made fast friends with a woman there who, over a glass of wine, told me about this thing called the tiny house movement or tiny houses and showed me pictures. And I just was immediately completely obsessed and spent a couple of months just scrolling Pinterest. And at this point, this was before the New York Times article had been written or published. And so it was mostly a kind of ad hoc, my familiarity. And I was talking to a really good friend of mine who was planning on moving to Portland, who was not a licensed contractor, but had much building experience. And he said, well, let's build you one. And I was like, you don't say that unless you mean it.
Right, exactly.
And so, yeah, it was I think maybe 4 months after I had first heard about tiny houses that we ordered the trailer and started building. Had never been in a tiny house before, had really no idea, I had no building experience. Thankfully, my building partner had lots of experience. So, I had some guidance, but in terms of conceptualizing the house, I conceived of it as just a like stick-built house shrunk down.
Hmm.
rather than just the amazing design ideas that we see now, where things have multiple
Hmm.
functions and can collapse and expand. And so the house is quite, in my mind, it's quite charming for its kind of, it's a little nostalgic build or something. It's like a little tiny cabin. But but it did make living in it quite difficult in some ways. I was like, I have to have a bookshelf, but the bookshelf took up about, a fifth of the room in the house. Maybe not the smartest design choice.
But you were just kind of winging it. So the design was kind of coming along as you were winging it. Okay. All right. But you've also
Yeah.
said that's kind of a personality trait. So
Yeah.
it
Yes.
all goes together.
It all goes together. And there was a real kind of magic in going to the restore. And I was very, both in my aesthetic taste and my ethics, I was really committed to using as much found materials as we could. And thankfully, we were building in Portland, Oregon, where there's a lot of, there's a big restore, there's lots of Habitat for Humanity outlets. And there was a certain magic that I haven't experienced before or since of going into the store and being like, oh, this piece of wood is so cool. Okay, what are we gonna do? And so that kind of it felt like a relationship that wasn't purely like my design or his expertise. It was like, okay, what do we find? How do we incorporate it? And it made for a very like emotionally significant house where every
That
piece of wood, every window, everything has a story. And thankfully I found, the people who ended up buying it, and we can, get to that. But got very, very lucky in that the people who bought the house were very invested in those stories and wanted to know them and carry on the kind of spirit of the house.
okay,
And
good.
so,
Yeah, because I do want to talk about that because I couldn't understand the letting go of it. And as you were sharing this, it was becoming a little more concerning. Like, how did you let go of this? So I do want to talk about that, but that makes perfect sense.
yes, yes, it was
Yeah,
hard. A lot of, yeah,
I
it was very
yeah,
hard.
I can imagine that. So how did you even decide like on the length of the house, not having a plan? How did you decide what size house you were building?
Yeah, I sort of blindly, I think. The
Okay.
first plans that we had downloaded oh my gosh, I'm completely blanking on Jay Schaefer's company.
Oh,
Lord,
tumbleweed.
thank you, Tumbleweed. Yes. Wow. So we had downloaded the like $90 Tumbleweed plans, and I think it
Okay.
said 16-foot trailer, and so we were like, well, this is what we do. Um,
Okay.
and that, and then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to be living in Oregon. I need a little bit of a porch. So we downloaded the one with the little square porch, and did not realize that every one of those decisions cut into the space, the internal space of the
Mm-hmm.
house.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, it is a very, very small, tiny house compared to what we see now. Which I think, has its benefits, but does make the living. It was a lot more difficult than I had planned on. And you know, um, it caused me to lean. I mean, in some good ways and some really, I think, consumptive ways. Like I couldn't buy food in bulk. I couldn't cook in bulk. And so in a lot of ways, there were things that actually increased my footprint, if we could talk about it that way,
Mm-hmm.
that I wouldn't have anticipated and would have been different had I built a little bit bigger, had there been infrastructure for tiny house communities,
Mm-hmm.
that would have been,
Mm-hmm.
I probably would have lived in the house a lot longer. And then I ended up getting a position on the East Coast, and I couldn't afford to take it. And my partner was like, we cannot live in 10 square feet and maintain a healthy relationship. So
That was the deal breaker.
yes, I
That was
mean,
the deal breaker.
to his credit, I think he was right about that. Yeah.
Yeah, somehow I think so too. As much as I like to be a proponent of couples can do tiny house living, I think that would have just been pushing it too much. Okay, so
Yes.
I am going to share pictures of your house and then have you talk through them.
Okay.
And then we are going to get back to our discussion once I figure out how to get there. Okay, so this is just getting started.
This is the very, very first day. And
Very
this is
okay.
one of the first times I had ever used a big tool. But yes, this is the very first day, and we had picked up the trailer the day before. Had thankfully had some friends who had a little bit of building space and also tools that we used in the very beginning. And then we ended up relying on the Portland Tool Library, which, what a resource. I mean, my God, that should be in every community across the world. Those tool libraries are such a godsend. Um,
And I think it's
yeah.
important to call out. So you said this is your first day and you kind of jumped in it. And then the resources, because one of the things that I know will hold people back, and this is even, kind of how you've shared how you got into the journey. You didn't have a fully baked plan. You didn't have all of the tools. You didn't have all of the stuff that sometimes people will hold themselves back because they feel like I've got to have everything in place up front before I can begin. And then, so your story is absolutely saying, that doesn't always have to be the case.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on our personality and our
Hmm.
capacity.
Hmm.
I'm a planner, but I also do like the magic of falling in love with, for instance, the floor, the inside floor. We found this amazing um, old benches from a gym and had no idea how to get them planed to get them into the tiny house. Oh yeah, you can see them. Oh, that's my mama and my sister-in-law right there.
Oh,
um,
very nice.
they are and but we had it. I actually don't even. Oh, I think somewhere in my neighborhood where we were building the house, I had seen a house being torn down, and I
Okay.
left a note on the material. There was just like a pile of material. I left a note on the material like, "Hey, I'd love to use this stuff." The owner of the property got a hold of me and he said, that is actually the material's already spoken for, but I'd love to help you out if you need anything. And I said, well, do you by chance have a planer? And he said, actually, my neighbor has a planer, but it's, 1,000 pounds. So I don't know how we would move it. And he got his neighbor. There was like three neighbors, and then myself and my building partner. We were all able to get the planer into the truck and get it over to our house to fix the floor.
Oh, wow.
So all that to
And this
say
was a complete
that
stranger.
with a complete stranger, yes, it was just like it. I think so all that to say that I have been incredibly lucky. Um, and also I do think there's something to be said of like, a leap of faith as and that the floor kind of comes up to meet you, which is not meaning to be a
Hmm.
pun when we're talking
Hmm.
about the floor, but I think in this case it actually was true. But I also recognize that I have a lot of community support, and I think there's something to be said when we talk about this kind of aphorism of like it's a leap of faith and you just take a step and then the resources come to meet you, is like that's also an immense privilege for to be able to
Yeah.
say that and to have it be
Yeah.
true, right?
Yeah.
um
Absolutely.
and so if I think there's a balance of if you have time, or if you have money, or if you have a big community network, um,
Agree.
like each of those allows us to take a leap of faith. And you know, I think you can wait for a long time, you can lean heavily on community, or you can pay for it.
Agree. Agree.
And I
And like
really
you said, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh, I said I just got really lucky that I
Yeah.
had the community networks. Yep.
And like you said, and I talk about that often, there is some privilege some financial privilege involved, and I talk about acknowledging, to be able to spend the money to build and buy a tiny house, when there are a segment of people who don't have housing and they need tiny houses for housing. There is absolutely a privilege associated with the ability and to make those choices, and we have to recognize that. And I always feel like, and so people, the conversation that has been had about whether tiny houses are an appropriation of poverty, and
Yeah.
recognizing that privilege. And I've said I don't necessarily feel that, but
Yeah.
those of us who have had the privilege to be able to buy houses and be in this position have to remember that there's a flip to that, and we have to be willing to do the work to help pull those people along.
Yes, and I think that thank you. That's so well said. And it reminds me too of the distinction too between like the folks who have, the motivation to think about building or living in a tiny house. There's a real spectrum of that, and the ways that different media outlets have picked up on the popularity and are advertising it. The aesthetics of the tiny house living often really play up this kind of like the bougie fetishization of going
Right,
tiny, simple living, right? Where it's like, well,
right,
what simple living is poverty. And like
right.
people in poverty aren't thinking like, oh, look at this in my like, my beans in this cool ball jar. Like
Exactly. Exactly. Or the paint choices. Exactly. Absolutely.
right, right.
Yeah.
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 So we were looking at the build of the roof, the gambrel roof, which was this was completely my building partner. His name is Jason Wrights. It was his brilliant idea, and we had not actually seen a gambrel roof on a tiny house. And I followed his instructions. He like figured out a jig, how to make the jig for the roof, and we basically knew we were going to have a gambrel roof, and we were waiting to find a window that fit in that front space.
Okay.
And that's a one, I think, advice that I like really vehemently offer is put regular house size windows in your tiny house, because it can be very dark. And you know this, Jewel, your place
Yeah,
is filled with light.
absolutely.
It's amazing. And that front window was so key to just feeling like, part of the benefit of living in a tiny house is you get really connected to what's outside of your house.
Right.
So you want to see it,
Right.
but
And
it's
so you
hard to
don't feel
find.
like you're in a box.
Exactly. Yeah, like we don't, I mean, we love, God bless Henry David Thoreau, who talked about living in a box car, like a train box car. You know,
Yeah.
it does provide shelter, but I don't want to live in a coffin.
No, exactly. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. So
So
but
that's
it
the
did,
window installed. It's beautiful.
that is the window installed, and it did heat up the place quite quickly. So and like the very first thing I did when I moved in was the next day I went out and bought a ceiling fan and replaced. I just had a cool, really cool antique light in the main part of the house, and I replaced it the next day with a ceiling fan because
Okay.
the airflow it needed more airflow.
Yeah. That loft space, I'm sure, was amazing right there at that big window.
The houseplants loved it. The cats loved it. Oh.
Yeah. Uh-oh. You
Mm.
missing your home.
Ugh. Yeah, it was such a special time to do this. It was really, yeah. Embrace change, right?
Exactly.
That's what
That's what
life
they
is.
say.
It's sometimes very hard.
That's what they say. Is that your
That's
little
what
cat door?
That is a little
Did you?
cat door. My kitties have since passed that lived in the tiny house with me, but
I'm
I
sorry.
was, life without cats for me is impoverished life. So I was I was determined to be able to have them have a good little life, and it ended up being like their house,
Yes, they just
like a
let you
big cat
stay.
house that they let me live in.
I've not seen a gambrel roof, I don't think, on anyone I know home. So it was interesting to see the bones of it. Very cool. And very cool thing to go for on your first time building a tiny house. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, it was it added so much space, especially, in the sleeping loft was really key.
Yeah, very nice.
Oh.
Uh,
Oh.
So this
Ugh.
is finished, and this is actually when you were advertising it to sell it, right?
Yes, which was a
Yes.
really eye-opening, as you can imagine, experience. We had moved, my partner and I had moved to the East Coast he started a PhD program. I was finishing my PhD, and we had no space to move it. It's also terribly expensive, as you can imagine, to move it. And so the first year we were on the East Coast, I managed to find some folks to live in there, and then it sat empty for about 6 months, and that started to really weigh on me. It felt like irresponsible to have this home that was the product of so much care being kind of
Mm-hmm.
ignored,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
and I did not have the capacity to care for it. And there's a longer story about I was living in my grandmother's backyard, who just passed away last week.
Yeah, I'm so
Ooh,
sorry, April. Mm.
oh, I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry, April. Oh no, I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
No, it's so wonderful to have this conversation actually in this context. But um, and she had just been diagnosed with dementia, and the house was in her backyard, and it felt like it didn't feel right for me to be asking her to care for this house, whether passively or actively. And so I put it up for sale, and it was just a strange thing because I was living on the East Coast. I didn't have really anyone, like a liaison essentially for the house. And so I ended up a good friend of mine who was getting her real estate license, volunteered to help me sell it. And it was really eye-opening, the different types of interest uh, that came into my life because of that. And you know, there were some folks who wanted to buy it that gave me very bad spidey like my spidey sense started tingling in really bad ways.
It's not good. No, you can't have my house.
You can't have my house. It doesn't like that is just not it would be irresponsible for me to not, show up for the commitment that I made to this, and that all of my network made by gifting their times and materials and care, to not be cautious. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, I'm gonna figure something else to do. And I came home from I had kind of an open house where people came by and to look at it, and I thought, okay, well, selling it is not the right thing to do. And I had taken a nap, and I woke up, and there was an email from this couple in Seattle who had written a love letter to the tiny house.
To your
And
house?
yes, and it was the most remarkable moment. Like it was a love letter to me and to the house, and it was like it was a love letter about what they loved about the house, and also their vision, why they wanted it. And they were starting a forest school on their property, and they wanted it to house the teacher that was going to teach their child, their 4-year-old, and a number of other little ones, in this forest school. And I just thought,
Oh wow.
oh my God,
Perfect.
this
Yeah.
is why I built the house, actually. Like I was just caretaking it.
Yeah.
until it found them. Which was I think it was the only way I could have let it go. Because
Yeah.
it was, the tiny house came in, like I built it to live in for my PhD, and it was a very insular time in my life where I was working 80 hours a week and, all for good, but the tiny house really held me in that time. And I felt like it was so sacred, um, that I couldn't have let it go under other conditions. And this is not to say that this has to be this kind of relationship for anybody with tiny houses. Like, I don't think that, but it definitely was for me.
No, I get that completely. Because as you know, we talked before, and when I knew you were selling the house, and as I see other people sell their houses that I've known who've been in the movement kind of since I started, I keep thinking I couldn't do that. Like I have such an attachment to my home, and maybe that's not healthy, but I can't do that. Like it was really even hard for me the other year when I had to figure out the time between finding a safe location, and I was in the apartment and I was Airbnbing it. That was really hard for me to allow others inside my home. And I was doing the same thing, kind of reading profiles and messages, and because I didn't want just anyone in my space, but it still felt, and I was grateful for them that they did book and stay because it helped me financially. But then when it was time to come back, it didn't feel like home because others had been in my house, and that is what
Interesting.
prompted the entire tiny house remix that I have done since I've been here. Like I redid flooring, first sage and deep clean, and
Yeah.
stripped out the flooring and paint and all of that so that it could become home again for me because it didn't feel like that. So that connection to your house, and again, when I start and I say the journey, I feel like it's bigger than the house, but the house becomes so much part of the conversation. It's not like the physicalness of the house. It is more of almost a spiritual connection with
Yes.
the house. And I think that's exactly what you just said as well.
Yes. Yes, and I think that, that it when I built it, I knew that it was related to my work. Both my, environmental consciousness and concerns, and a way to like practice what I was studying. And I just had no idea how much it was going to teach me about
Hmm.
my own privilege, my own, I think I always thought that I grew up quite poor. My family uh, comes from, generational poverty. And I thought that, uh, that kind of identity, I guess, maybe for lack of a better word, looms quite large. And so then building the tiny house, I had to confront how much privilege I actually have. And it really made me think, like I had clung to this story of growing up poor, um, as the hardship. And it was, I mean, much more for my mother and her family than myself. But that really prevented me from like showing up for how much privilege I do have. And especially when studying environmental politics, the ways that whiteness and straightness and, all of these assumptions are imbued in mainstream environmentalism, has a lot to teach about addressing climate change and building movements that are intersectional. When we think about what just is coming down from the Supreme Court in the last week,
Right.
we, you know, if we don't connect climate change to control over people's bodies, we are, I don't want to say doomed, because I think doom bros are their own class of privilege, but that's the answer, like intersectional community-based networks that recognize the ways that we all hold privilege differently, and that privilege calls us to different responsibilities. Um, and the tiny house taught me all of that. Like it
Yeah.
just, in ways that I was not prepared for.
and that's where I wanted to take this conversation, because I know in the years ago when we connected, and the way I was navigating the movement and the challenges that I was having, it was like we were all having epiphanies, and you with school, and then the tiny house. So let's talk about that, because there was such a big connection, and I've read some of your blogs for you with school and living in the house, and you were just leading into that, the identity of recognition of privilege, and then also looking at the tiny house movement itself. And so there was a lot of things that happened for you, and that's kind of, after you start telling that story, then that kind of will weave into how we ended up connecting so many years ago.
Yeah, I think I had gone into my PhD program knowing that I was really interested in the how do I actually describe this? I was really interested in the ways that uh, systems of racial formation, or how the concepts of what we now call race get formalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or codified. And even codified and formalized are not great terms, because race as categories are really flexible. They have changed over time. But I was really interested in how these were, especially in like 19th century America, they were getting concepts of race are getting written into law, even as they change. At the same time as I had always heard or been taught, environmentalism as we know it began, right? So we have, and so, I moved into the tiny house. I had these questions, and I kept reading, in particular, in the tiny house movement, people quoting Thoreau. And Thoreau is the grandfather of tiny house living, and he was the model of sustainability and self-reliance and all of these things. And I thought, well, you're clearly not living in a tiny house, because self-reliance is bullshit. Excuse my language. Like, I mean, I had more self-reliance when I was in a 2-bedroom little 800 square feet house. Like, I just thought, and so especially my first year of living in a tiny house, I really was just like slamming into the unrealities of so much of the rhetoric that was happening in the tiny house movement. And the ways that, my footprint felt larger. I felt more isolated, but also more reliant on other people in ways that didn't in like not good ways. They didn't feel like reciprocal. It felt like I was leaning on
Mm-hmm.
people much more than I was giving to people. And so, as someone who adored and still does, I get a lot out of Thoreau's writing, but who really considered myself in line with this kind of story about environmental thinking that dates back to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And then I started reading them carefully, especially Emerson. And I thought, well, first of all, Emerson is speaking nonsense. Like, he doesn't actually make a lot of sense. And also, like, he's a raging white supremacist. And, it's like, it's not even and so many people, I mean, I think, and I have been guilty of this, will have said, well, he was just a product of his time, right?
Yeah.
And that's also nonsense. Like, there were people, probably less white people at that time recognized, because they weren't being subject to the violences of white supremacy. But, you ask any person of color or indigenous person at that time, and they knew that it was nonsense. You know what I mean? Like, and so I thought, okay, first of all, why are we holding up people like Thoreau when what he is saying is so clearly antithetical to the experiences of tiny house living? Like, so there's this disconnect. And also, why are we telling this story of environmental thinking that doesn't make sense and is clouded or shrouded in white supremacist logic, when we know that systems of white supremacy have been used to justify the extraction economies that tiny house living is supposedly working against? So this is like counter, like, even if even if we didn't care about other people, right? Even if we didn't care about the ethics of white supremacy, the environmental logics are what is contributing. Those are the environmental logics that are changing our climate, that are making environments unlivable. And so it was a real, as I slammed into the corners of the tiny house, I like slammed into my own assumptions of what environmentalism is and was, and that is my work now. That's what I work on, is the ways that people like Emerson are not environmentalists. They are fiction writers. They are white supremacist fantasy writers who are justifying their own benefits and privileges, and covering over the violences that make those privileges possible. And the more that we repeat their fictions, the more we are hemmed in to this thinking that is destroying the planet. So thank you for letting me give my little, sermon or whatever this Sunday morning.
That is why I wanted to be sure that we circled back to have this conversation, because I knew you were going to give it. And these conversations, these are the conversations I can't give, because then I get labeled as a racist. But when it's coming from your mouth, then
Yep.
Folks have to listen, or they should be listening, versus me having said everything that you said. So I want to go back to, I want to come back to the, true, that is not. But I want to go back to something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, about recognizing privilege. And that to me is the thing that people struggle with so much. When you said, we grew up in poverty, I recognize poverty, having grown up in that. But I also recognize I have privilege, because that is the thing that so many white people get stuck on. No, we were poor growing up. Show me my privilege. Where is my privilege? That is the thing that people get stuck on yeah, there is some privilege in whiteness, just plain whiteness. We're not saying you got a credit card because you were white, but you might have. But we're saying you don't have the struggles that we have simply because of the color of your skin. That is the privilege there. That's it.
Yes. Yes. Well, it strikes me a little bit like that conversation too. I mean, there's a couple things I want to say about that. Is one, it strikes me as the math is going the wrong way, right? So we think about, or I think about, my family also. We just had a celebration of life for my grandmother yesterday, and I heard some family members say things, near to this, which is, we're poor, we don't benefit from white supremacy. Like there's people of color, Black people who are making millions of dollars as athletes, right? Don't tell me that I have white privilege. And it's because we fail to, or I fail to articulate clearly, race is a fiction. Whiteness is not a stable signifier. It's a relationship to property. And we benefit from those relations, right, in actions differently. But, white people suffer from under white supremacy also. Like this is not, this is not a purely beneficial relationship. And part of how someone like me suffers is being trapped in this idea that poverty is the only thing that defines me. And it then prevents me from recognizing my privileges, which also prevents me from recognizing my responsibilities. And my responsibilities are how I live in like abundant community. And so and this is such a, that argument is such a pipeline to far right radicalization, right? Mm-hmm. So we see the ways that young, often poor white folks think, don't talk to me about privilege, right? Like, and so rather than saying, I mean, this is my job, and I feel like my job is to say, oh, I'm not saying that you're not suffering, right? It's that you don't walk into a store and have assumptions made about you because of how you present. Absolutely. And so there's not a one-to-one relationship between how we present and and the kind of money we make, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, it's the job of people like me, who I really feel like I have I'm uniquely positioned to have some of those conversations because I come from, uh, uh, poor white people, and that who know so well too, that you talk to anyone in my family and they immediately recognize that just because you work hard doesn't mean you're going to get what you deserve, right? So they understand really deeply how unfair the economic systems are, but then they are, I think, they're not or and I don't want to think it's I don't think it's necessarily their fault. I think it's how we're packaging privilege, like rhetorically, is that they understand that they're being told that they owe something to someone because they're white, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
wrong direction of the math, right? It's not that you owe these things. It's that all these systems that have created your position of poverty have affected other people more. That's why the
Exactly.
solidarity goes that way, right? Like that's
Exactly.
why we have to be allied with people who are the primary targets of these systems, because if we stop those systems at their primary targets, we protect ourselves.
Right.
We make ourselves safer, not by joining in those systems and exploiting people, because that's what whiteness is, right? It's a property relation
Mm-hmm.
based on exploitation, and that capitalism promises us that if we engage in that system and we commit violence in one way or another, we benefit and exploit people, then we have access to the privileges of whiteness. So,
Yeah.
whiteness doesn't need white people, right? We see this in the Proud Boys movement and lots of far right movements that
Mm-hmm.
are turning to like the rhetoric of multiculturalism, um, and yet still relying on these myths of whiteness to recruit people into their system. So, solidarity with people of color, with fighting to get indigenous people's land back, to get reparations, like that is the core of climate justice work. It's the core of addressing climate change, and it's also personally completely transformative. Like I have experienced such profound spiritual transformation in um, dealing with my shit, for lack of a better way to say that. I mean, not that it's done by any means, but I'm working on it. And the tiny house
Working on it.
really, really, like, it was a profoundly sacred space for me that held me at the same time as it like slammed me into some of those things.
Yeah. I think part of what you just said reminds me of that quote that is attributed to Lyndon Johnson, where he said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket." That's what that goes.
Yes,
That is exactly
exactly,
what that goes to. Um,
exactly. Yes, thank you
Instead
for
of
that quote.
being like the solidarity that you were just saying, where we're all suffering from these systems.
Yeah.
That quote there is what makes sure that we're not able to work together. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. And this
Yeah.
is, we talked about this really briefly last time before we got cut off, which is just the increasing embrace of climate concern. I'm putting that in quotations.
Mhm.
Um, Climate concern by so-called far right. I think this is happening on the so-called left as well, where climate change is now being used as a reason for calls for population control, for instance, right? And first of all, just I think it bears repeating. Population control, we know that it's a eugenicist argument, but also if we were to take it seriously, we know that population rebounds, right? So it's
Right.
ineffective as an environmental solution, but also population, like even if we're thinking about population control for the most consumptive populations, right? Population has been on the decline in the United States, the most consumptive nation per capita in the world. it's been on the decline at the same time as carbon emissions has increased. So population control does not work, and it's
Mm-hmm.
only a rhetorical move that affects that strengthens control over certain populations and certain population bodies.
Right.
So
Right.
these kind of arguments are they're on the increase, and we really have to be vigilant to the ways that it seeps in, not just from the right or whatever that means. I think that that's problematic too, but the ways that it comes into our environmental discourse in like everyday ways, that is really insidious. And stuff like the tiny house movement has a really unique, I think we're really uniquely positioned to intervene in those conversations, because the tiny house movement is in some ways like in conversation with like the degrowth movement in Europe and these like living small. But those movements are very much emerging out of population control debates in the mid 20th century. So I think tiny house living and the tiny house movement is really uniquely positioned to have these conversations, not just about living simply, but about the ways that our lived experience is actually the basis for organizing, for like movements, for
Absolutely.
solidarity,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
imagining infrastructure. Um,
Yeah.
that's like the magic, I feel like, of tiny houses.
Yeah, that is the magic. That once I built my house, and that's how I always tell the story. Once I built my house and then connected with early on, connected with the people that were considered the tiny house leaders, and I felt like we were going to, as we were challenging the cities and the government entities to allow tiny houses, that we were also going to be challenging the status quo and the problems of housing, and that in these conversations we would look at, not just we want to be able to live in small houses, but we also in this conversation are including the people who aren't able to live in conventional houses, who aren't buying the conventional houses, who um, annually, year after year, are at the bottom of the barrel in home ownership. So if we're challenging the housing status quo, let's bring all of those people into the conversation and make sure we're righting the wrongs, kind of like what you just said, so that we are doing this. We're not just following the same patterns and systems in place for large houses. We're rethinking this so that the small houses, we're rethinking how housing works.
Yes.
That's what I thought. And then I got a big no, that's not what we're doing. We just want to be able to live in our small houses. And that part of it was so disappointing, especially as I started, kind of naively going into it and not recognizing early on that my experience would be different, because taking my
Yeah.
house to an RV park, I'm running into racism. Out in rural areas, I'm running into racism where my counterparts are being successful. So now even going to a tiny house festival, running into racism because those festivals are out in rural areas. And so I'm thinking, kind of like what we said, it is the color of my skin, because I'm walking in these places just like my counterparts. I'm living in a house just like my counterparts, but I'm having a totally different experience that I hadn't initially considered. And then when I started saying to my counterparts, hey, let's talk about this, because you all are hosting workshops, you all are selling your house plans, and you're selling them to people of color, you're selling them to Black people. So instead of just selling them, you all also need to be responsible to be part of this conversation, to say, yes, you can build these plans, but have you considered where you're going to put it? Are you considering that your journey to where you're going to put it is going to be doubly hard, because it's hard to have a place for a tiny house, and then it's going to be harder for you as a Black person, as a person of color. That is what the conversation should have been like. That is what I have said since 2015. These are the conversations that we should be having as we talk about inclusive, accessible communities, as we talk about where are we going to put these tiny houses. We need to be having the separate conversation, the add-on conversation, so that everybody can be in this movement. And it was crickets, um, straight crickets, and asking people to support, straight crickets. I see I see Black faces on these white spaces now, but I know now well, really kind of around George Floyd, when everyone was amplify Black voices, because then it's cool. Oh, we're going to amplify the Black voices because now everybody says it's cool. So we'll have the Black voices on our platforms. And because it's making us money to have
Yeah.
those Black, but so now it's okay. But when I was saying it years ago about why we need to do this from a safety perspective, from a everybody should be able to be in this movement perspective, it was crickets. And so that is the disturbing part for me. That is why I feel like it's important that we have these conversations. That is why I feel like this type of a platform is important. And when I go back to the people that I was able to connect with at that time, who were like, you're right, what do we need to be doing? I always go back to you emailing, how can I help? What do I need to do? And then you using your own voice. So that was kind of where our connection, and like you were having your epiphany and I was having the experience, and we kind of met. And you've written, so let's talk about the work that I know you've written articles specifically about the tiny house movement and privilege and your observations. um
Mhm.
Anything else you want to share in around in that realm?
Yeah, I think, well, thank you. That's really generous of you, first of all. I mean, it's the least I could do, and I felt like, as my work kind of moved away. I mean, it didn't really move away from tiny houses, but I felt increasingly fraudulent to write about the tiny house movement when not living in one. Felt a little, but but in my writing, I think one thing that I kept recognizing too is just, and in what you're talking about too, is like, even as the representation in the tiny house movement has changed, and thank God, some of that has changed. There's still the infrastructure of environmentalism. It's white. The aesthetics are white. It's like the what is that Netflix, inside that pandemic film where there's that white ladies of Instagram on Instagram.
I
And
haven't watched that.
it's so funny. Oh man. But environmental aesthetics, it doesn't just change overnight. And so we have, as increasing representation is, I think, really important. People like me also have to recognize that, that also puts people of color in also increasingly precarious positions. So maybe the representation inside the movement is changing. That doesn't necessarily mean that, like, in certain spaces that you bring your tiny house and you step out as a person of color, it doesn't strike someone as deeply wrong because they've been disciplined by white supremacy to see that as wrong. And so all that to say is, like, working on policy changes, infrastructure changes, like all of those things are important. And I hope that that's part of, my work teaching, and my work in, and it's unfortunate that my work continues to be more and more relevant. But I'm almost done with my book, which is on the ways that our imaginations of climate change have been long constrained by this version of environmentalism that codes white supremacy into our assumptions. And this is way we see, people like the Buffalo mass murderer cite climate change as a reason for slaughtering Black people. And as much as we can intellectualize that as just crazy, right?
Right.
To think that that's a climate solution. The fact is that logic is nothing new. It's long been, and I would argue it has been there since Emerson, since what we call the beginning, or Thomas Jefferson, and his racist notes on Virginia, or all the way back to John Locke, whose idea of property was used to steal land from indigenous peoples and slaughter them and dig up their graves and eat them. Like, this is not fiction. This is in the colonial record, right? Like,
Right.
people wrote that they were doing this. So, you know, unless there's a real understanding of that through line and the ways that that through line continues to constrain our imaginations, myself included, then, you know, we're going to be kind of hemmed into that thinking that is, it is, you know, killing the planet, or at least killing the livability for most species on this planet. And I think that, oh God, I just completely lost my train of thought. But all that to say that, you know, it doesn't have to be, you know, I really agree with folks who say we can't build what we can't imagine, right? That we have to, imagination is so key. And that the tiny house movement is such a paradigm of that. Like we imagine and we build. And I also think that there's no way that we have to recognize and be compassionate towards our imaginations and our limitations, different limitations, bits depending. And yet we know that returning Indigenous land to Indigenous peoples is one of the fastest climate solutions that we have. Indigenous peoples make up 5% of global population and protect 80% of global biodiversity. Returning Indigenous lands is happening everywhere. It's happening at the state level, the federal level. Churches are giving land back. Individuals are giving land back. Similar to reparations, right? Like it is not this kind of unfathomable thing. It's happening all over. And so for, you know, and that really invites us to enter into those relations of reparations, of land back in really individual ways. Like we can figure out what is right for ourselves and what feels right for our capacity and do that. And that to me has been the biggest game changer. And I think I learned that really from the tiny house, thinking about this rhetoric of mobility that is so alive in the tiny house movement, but economic mobility or tiny houses on wheels and moving around, and that mobility is like the original reason, like if we go back to political theory, is the very original reason that colonists used to justify stealing Indigenous lands, right? Is that they didn't have a relationship to property. They were mobile. And so the tiny house is like, it has all of that. It has like all of that history and all of that potential. And then any engagement with the movement, I think, is really transformative. And so even from the most doom bro prepper tiny house liver, right? I have to believe that there's something kind of magical about trying to live these ideas and then recognizing these ideas are maybe not as simple as we were told that they are, right? So
Yeah. And so I feel like the conversations that we have and we're having, and the conversations that I try to have here, it's a different person. Well, let me start here. In the workshops that I've hosted, I've always said that, or shared to the person that they shared with the person that they need to be prepared that this journey, the home, all of that, it's not just about building a stick built house. It's a total journey that changes them. The house becomes part of them, you know, all of that. I recognize that that's not the same for everyone, and not everyone has that connection. But the hope is just kind of what you just said, that it does become something that makes the person think outside of themselves in this journey, versus I just built a tiny house and I'm going to continue being this human that I've been in other spaces without doing some more introspection. That
yeah,
really is my hope. Yeah. Thank you,
yes, I
Marina,
think,
for the super chat.
and I think that your you know, your work, Jewel, is just it's so vital to creating, you know, we can't force folks to have epiphanies, right? And that's part of this kind of hero narrative that we're taught, right? That like I alone can change the world, which is just it's just nonsense,
Right.
and also completely paralyzing. And your work is so central to inviting, making invitational space, right? I think that's all we can do in the ways that we're called to and have capacity. And yeah, we're just so lucky to have you, Jewel.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, April. has there been a point since selling the house and that you've missed the house and almost, rethought the selling decision, or thought, maybe later on I'll build another tiny house? What does that feel
Oh
like?
man. Yes. Well, yes and yes. I miss it all the time, and also to be to be totally transparent and honest. My partner, we met when I was living in the tiny house, and he said that the first time our second date was actually a tiny house conference in Portland.
Oh, you all were living it big.
Yeah, we went real quick. And he said that the tiny house felt like I had built a little fortress for myself. And I thought, that is true. And
Hmm.
it was like a little safe space for me. And I don't know that I don't think that that was a bad thing. That I needed it, and it was right. And also then it came time to let that form of protection and self-protection go for me. And all that to say is there are definitely times where I feel like I just want to be back in that little house
And
with my kitties, and and just being held by that space. I think is it's something that I always miss, and I also do fantasize about building another one. And I think not to be so on white girl trend, but I think if I were to do it again, it would definitely be something where the motor is attached to the house, so like a van or a
I
truck or
got you.
something,
Got you.
because I do want a little more like mobile infrastructure to be able to take on long road trips, and
Hmm.
um, you know to go stay with a friend in a friend's backyard without having to have uh, that the kind of infrastructure that a tiny house demands. So, but yes, I think, and I think even since I built the house, I was fantasizing about what I would have done differently had I known or seen all these brilliant ideas that people come up with. That like logic puzzle part of the building of the tiny house is just so addicting and fun. So
Yeah.
I would do it again. Maybe once. Well, we'll see. We'll see if it ever happens. But I would also love to like help someone. Miss I miss the smell of like sawdust.
I hate that. I honestly hate going around new construction sometimes, because it does bring about a nostalgia. And it's like, Jewel,
Yes,
sit your ass down. You
yes,
cannot take on another project. But it is something. It's almost like running races. Like I've run some half marathons, and like halfway through I'm like, what was I thinking? I hate running. I hate running. And then as soon as you finally get to the finish line, it's like, oh, I'm gonna sign up for another race. And it's like, no, you hate it. Like, so yeah,
yes.
I understand that completely. Something I wanted to call out. Somebody, Lotus, mentioned that it was you made an interesting point about the history of tiny houses being linked to mobility and indigenous communities, because it seems like the minimalist movement would have you believe it started with two white men. Yes,
Yes,
yes, and yes. Yes,
yes,
we've talked about that so many times, of how it's I've often talked about it with why the question when the question comes up is, why aren't black people interested in tiny houses? And when I first was in the movement, there was in a group, and somebody was sharing some pictures of something they had done over the weekend. And it was all white people in these pictures. And somebody commented in the group, they were like, "Where are all the black people?" And I was like, "Oh, this is getting ready to hit the fan right now." And so I'm just watching the thread. But I mean, I knew the answer. And so somebody said, "Well, why would you have to? We were just having a good time. Why would you bring that in?" And so I just kept watching it, and I said, one, representation. Everybody wants to see themselves represented. So,
Yep.
and I flipped it. If you were interested in something and you went somewhere and it was all Black people, as a white person, you'd wonder, is this for me? Should I be here? Am I safe here? And then on the flip side of that is, um, Black people weren't really interested in tiny houses at that time, and they were becoming more interested in it because they've lived in these small houses. Success in America looks like big in excess, and if you've always, if you had to live in this tiny house because you had to, why in the world would I want to live in a tiny house now? Or and
Yep.
your grandmother or your great grandmother, or you're a couple of generations removed from a tiny house, you're a couple of generations removed from a house with an outhouse, and none of that looks like anything I want to do, because spend my money to do. And so the
Been on
sale
that.
is hard. Yeah, the sale is hard. And so yeah, that those, you have to really think about it. Yes, it's on wheels, but that's not where it started. And so the comments are
Mhm.
talking about all of the houses that have existed before this tiny house movement, indigenous people, and I get it. So I did want to point that out. So thank you
Mhm.
all for those comments. Something I was
And
just getting ready to ask.
can I
Oh, sorry,
throw
go
a little
ahead.
plug really quick?
Absolutely.
And then, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jewel.
No,
The
no.
Just two plugs. One is fiction and one is real life. But the Secwepemc people in northern British Columbia on the west coast, like very close to the Canadian-U.S. border, have been building tiny houses to put on their traditional territory in the line of a pipeline.
Pipeline,
And so
absolutely.
I think, like, oh my God, that's like, it's such a brilliant strategy, right? To one, it's a practice of indigenous sovereignty, and the mobility that comes from this long history of indigenous sovereignties is being used to frustrate the building of a pipeline. They've been arrested, they've been brutalized, and they are fighting, and they're fighting like the hard good fight. And just as a fiction plug, the new show Rutherford Falls, the last, not no spoilers, but the last episode of the second season features a tiny house community. So I was very excited. And Rutherford Falls is an indigenous written and indigenous led show, and it's so brilliant and good. So there's just a couple of plugs
Okay,
about how
I'm
relevant.
making a note to catch Rutherford Falls. That's, yeah. I have watched the journey with the homes in blocking the pipeline, and you're right, that's brilliant. And it's also sad to watch as it's happening, and they're being brutalized. Just all of it is sad, but the use of it and their strength and all of that is just amazing to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, they are holding it down. Mm-hmm.
So if you on the outside looking in, April, so you were in the movement, you know all the ins and outs of the movement. Your tiny house absolutely opened your eyes. Looking at the movement now, advice that you might give to like a love letter to the movement, or and even some advice to somebody that's interested in the movement. What are your thoughts?
Woo, love that question. I this is gonna sound very woo-woo, but what's coming up is like trust the magic and like follow the magic. I think the commodification of the tiny house movement has been happening. It's happening hardcore. It will be happening even more as housing insecurity gets even more serious. And for us to just hold in our minds the realities that the tiny house movement is not just about having a tiny house in your backyard that you Airbnb or you
Airbnb,
make,
right?
you know, and no judgment. Like, we're all trying to survive in one way or another.
Absolutely.
And I think, for those of us, I guess I'm not included in this, but for folks who have a bit of land that they're not using, thinking about opening up that space for a tiny house community, like the magic happens in the community. It doesn't happen in a single tiny house. and to just trust that magic and like lean in, and the steps will come up to meet us when we're resourced with community. I think is really the it's such a profound both spiritual and physical material lesson that the tiny house movement has for us.
Yeah. And I think within that trusting the magic, kind of like also trusting the magic, because there is so much magic, but also being a realist and paying attention and being responsible for, just kind of looking around and the others, like we were talking about the privilege and bringing others on, and just like you just can't be so insular that you're not able to see the other people around you and not have some responsibility within and for community. I feel like that's also part of what should be part of the magic, as people are looking
Yeah.
at the movement.
Yeah, no, I think thank you for that. That's such a vital, necessary amendment, that like the preconditions for the magic are our own, like it's my showing up and being okay with being wrong or called in some ways. And, knowing that like it's going to take all of us and all of our different capacities working in all different ways. And so, it's not going to look a certain way, but what it does look like is being responsible to community, right? And showing up, even and especially when it is uncomfortable, like discomfort.
Absolutely.
Woo! That is a big, big
Absolutely.
teacher. Comfort,
Absolutely. That discomfort. Absolutely. That's a very important part of that. So I know you are finishing up your book. What can you share the title of your book? Or
Sure. It is.
okay.
It's tentatively titled. We'll see if the publisher makes me change it. But it's tentatively titled "Unfensible: Ecofascism, Genre, and the Sovereignties That Can Save Us."
All
And
right.
so it's reading this kind of white supremacist movement in American environmental thinking, and then reading alongside it indigenous writers who were writing at the same time and imagining environmentalism, for lack of a better word, in more capacious and like personally rich ways, and using those as, or not using, but holding those thinkers up as models for our own imaginations today.
I'm looking forward to that. I'll have to have an autographed copy. I, I
Oh,
was doing
yeah.
I was doing some research and something about tiny houses, and then I saw a quote from Dr. April Anson. I was like, I know her. How cool is that? That was a
That's
cool
so
moment.
cool.
I know her. So when your book comes out, I definitely will have to have my autographed copy here at the house. Okay, so you've got that book coming up. I always ask, here's my question. What would be the title of your autobiography?
Holy moly, that is such a good question. Oh God, I don't know. What would it be? Maybe trying to show up. Like
I
I don't
like
know
that.
that I'm always doing it, but I feel like I've always been trying, imperfectly, though it may be.
No,
Um,
I definitely I see that for you. Like I know that you've always been a resource and available to me, especially through this journey. So I definitely would support trying to show up, and I feel like you have shown up. So I thank you for that. I thank
well,
you. I
thank you,
thank you
and
for always using your voice, and you are one of the people that I feel like has been. It's like you use your voice and it doesn't shake. Like sometimes I know I'm using my voice, but it's shaking because I'm trying to build up to it. But listening to you and reading the stuff that you put out, it's just like, this is it. This is uncomfortable places, but this is the realness of it, and here it is, and deal with it. So I appreciate that.
Well, I'm really honored by your words. That's yes, I aim to earn them. we'll see if I'm successful or not.
Yeah, I think you are earning them. I always say it's not our work to dismantle racism and white supremacy. You know, we end up talking about it the most because it impacts us, but
Yeah.
it is not our work. And so I appreciate when I do know people personally who are putting in the work. And so I have an appreciation for you for that.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to be able to do it. Like honestly, it's personally healing, it's generationally healing, it's like the most transformative work that we can do in our own ways. So
Absolutely.
yes. I also just, I would love to issue the invitation that if I can do that work for you and for anyone else in the movement, please, I'm available. My information is easily Googleable.
Absolutely. So is there anything that you have upcoming, speaking engagements, anything you shared your book, anything that you want to share for people to get in contact or follow, or anything that you want us to know about that you have coming up that we should be aware of?
Yes, well, it's not coming up. It just came out. I don't, if I drop it into the chat, will it show up for folks?
Well, you can drop it in the chat, and I'll also put it in the description of the video. I always add that kind of content, but I ask you to speak about it, and then I'll add it in the description in the video.
Okay, so here I'm going to drop in two links. They're both to the same resource, but
Oh, it might not. Okay.
they're different forms of the resource. So one link allows you to preview the document, another allows you to download it. But it's a project that I've been working on with four other folks the last year and a half, and it uses the Marvel movies. For those, I don't know if you're a Marvel movie fan, but the character of Thanos, right, was like the big villain, and he was an eco-fascist, expressed very like tried and true eco-fascist arguments about culling half of the universe because of resource scarcity. And the movies like completely let him off the hook, and the characters didn't respond. It seemed like he had good arguments, and so some colleagues of mine and I thought, what would happen if the Marvel characters were able to respond to his arguments, because they're nonsense, but they were let stand. And so we, over the last year and a half, reimagined the comic, basically, what would happen if they were able to respond, and came up with this webzine called Against the Eco-Fascist Creep that has a beginning comic version of these arguments, and then identifies 6 different kind of everyday expressions of ecofascism and why they're wrong. So offers very concise, easy to read, well-researched arguments that show they're not just counter arguments, because ecofascism is not an argument. It's not an opinion. It is just a fiction. That the arguments there's no environmental efficacy to those arguments, but they happen all the time in our rhetoric. And so this is it's free to download, free to share. And I think it turned out really, really well. So
It sounds like it.
It was so fun.
That sounds really cool, and I think I really like the medium that you're using, because I feel like it will touch people, reach people in like you need to reach people in the way they receive things. So in that genre, not expecting to have this conversation as associated with Marvel characters. I think that's excellent,
Yes.
and I love that.
And so fun. And shout out to my co-authors, because it was an incredibly rich experience, much more time consuming than we thought going in, which is the refrain, but does seem really, I think it's just so good. And I was very happy to lead it and happy to have it come out. And but was unfortunately came out 3 days after the Buffalo mass murder. And so it was just like, I don't want this stuff to be relevant, but unfortunately it is. Yeah. So it's like take it to your family holidays and share it online when you see this garbage being spouted. And I think that we can, we can stem the creep of ecofascism as it grows. So
Yeah, I will definitely share that in the video
yes, Anna
description.
wasn't calling it. Thank you, Lotus.
They are listening to you today, Dr. Anson. They are listening and connecting. You are making connections. And I always say the Sunday conversations, because it is so much bigger than the tiny house. And that's what these conversations show over and over again. And it becomes like a Sunday soothing something for the soul. And I really, really appreciate that you came and shared your time. And I'm glad we got to have this conversation, because we knew when we tried to kick it off before that it was going to be amazing, but technology wouldn't let us. So I'm grateful that we were able to do that today. What's one question, if or is there a question that I didn't ask that you wish I would have asked before we close out?
No, I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is I want you to I want to be useful to you. I guess. So
You always
ask me
are.
to be useful to you in some way. That's an open question or whatever.
Okay. I thank you for that. I thank you, thank you, thank you. I thank you for joining me early. Thank you for joining me because I know you were with family with the loss of your grandmother. I extend my condolences to you and your family again. And
Oh,
thank you.
thank you.
Um, Watching you tell your story and think of your grandmother, that was hard. And I thank you. And I'm so sorry. So
Thank you.
thank you for being here with me this morning. Love you much.
Love you much. Thank you, everyone.
I am going to close out. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful Sunday. Enjoy your time with your family. Let me close this out. Got me choked up, April. Thank
Mm,
you so much.
thank you.
So I thank you all for joining us. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. I always say thank you very much for the super chat. If you still have time, you can share your love and appreciation for these conversations, because these are the conversations that aren't being had that we want to keep making available around the movement, as we tie it all within the movement. So thank you for that love. Thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on your location. This again is the conversation on intimate spaces. I alternate on Sundays, and with the next Sunday will be What's Your Question, where I'm answering some of the frequently asked questions and sharing tips to help someone in or on their tiny house journey. So please join us next Sunday. Again, if you like the content, share it, like it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you'll be here next time when we go live. So again, April, thank you so, so much.
Thank
Everybody have a great rest of your Sunday, and I will talk to you soon.